In the early months of 1942, as the Pacific War line snapped and shifted across scattered islands, a small Japanese forward outpost sat perched on the edge of a lonely cliff. It was built quickly and without ceremony, little more than a wooden shack reinforced with sandbags, a dugout shelter carved into the limestone, and a radio tent anchored against fierce ocean winds. To most commanders, it barely mattered. It held no strategic value, no artillery, no supplies worth stealing. Its only real job was to watch the horizon, report ship movement, and endure long stretches of nothingness. Yet for the 20 or so men stationed there, it became a small world they were expected to survive in, far from their families and far from any real sense of the war they were supposedly fighting. For months, the outpost behaved exactly as expected. Routine radio checks every morning, weather reports, occasional confirmations of Allied planes passing high overhead. The men complained mostly about the heat, the mosquitoes, and the suffocating silence that settled over the place each evening. But everything changed on a humid night in late May. An Allied reconnaissance team positioned on a nearby ridge recorded seeing a rising plume of black smoke drifting up from the cliffs. At first, they assumed it was a signal fire or a malfunctioning generator, but the smoke kept growing, widening into a dense column that swallowed the tree line. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it thinned and dissolved into the night sky. The observers waited for follow-up activity, movement, lights, signs of repair. But nothing came, and by dawn, the radio from that outpost had gone completely silent. Japanese headquarters attempted contact repeatedly, first with commands, then with protocol challenges, then with increasingly urgent calls. The men at that post were well-trained, disciplined. They were not known to ignore orders, but no one responded, not once, not even a desperate burst of static. When the silence stretched into a second day, officers began to suspect sabotage or an Allied landing. When it stretched into a third, they considered sending a patrol. But communication lines were strained across the entire region. Ships were being redirected, supplies were scarce, and a forward post that technically wasn't essential was simply pushed lower on the priority list. By the time anyone attempted to investigate, the entire region was engulfed in shifting battles. The outpost faded into the background of war chaos. Allied observers, still stationed miles away, grew uneasy. On the fifth day of silence, one scout wrote a report describing flickering lights deep within the cliffside, not on the surface, as though something was burning or moving underground. The description made little sense. The cliff was solid limestone. There were no known caves large enough to host people, let alone military activity. But the scout swore he saw the lights shift, dim, then vanish entirely as though someone had smothered them. After the war, as both Japan and Allied nations began sorting through records, clearing abandoned sites, and accounting for missing personnel, the outpost resurfaced in paperwork. Technically, it still existed on maps. Supplies had been sent. A full roster of soldiers had been assigned there. But when post-war investigators finally reached it, they found nothing. Not a single helmet, not a rifle, not a bedroll, not even the remnants of the radio tent. The surface looked as if it had been stripped clean, then reclaimed by the jungle. The official report described it as evacuated, but nothing about the site hinted at an organized withdrawal. Evacuations left footprints, tools, scattered equipment, trash pits, half-buried fuel drums, something. Instead, the ground was strangely bare, as though the outpost had been erased. The only thing investigators agreed on was that the earth showed signs of disturbance, especially near the cliff's edge, where the soil bulged in uneven mounds. It looked like fresh earth, but it wasn't fresh at all. It had hardened under years of salt rain and sunlight, leaving it cracked and pale. Surviving Japanese soldiers who had served in that region offered conflicting explanations. Some insisted the outpost must have fallen to an Allied nighttime raid that was never documented. Others believed the men simply abandoned their position when supply lines broke. But one former corporal, interviewed decades later, shared a different story, one that unsettled military archivists. He remembered overhearing officers talk about reports from the cliff months before the disappearance. strange noises in the middle of the night, whispers carried by the wind, sudden dips in temperature around the lookout posts. He admitted he didn't believe any of it, but he remembered the look on one lieutenant's face, a look he described as fear without an enemy. When questioned further, he admitted that no one ever identified what the noises were, but that the men stationed there felt isolated in a way that went beyond typical wartime loneliness. Several of them wrote letters home describing sleepless nights and a feeling of being watched, even when no Allied ships were within reach. One soldier even requested a transfer, citing severe unease caused by the cliff. Command denied it. Allied patrol logs from the same period added more confusion. A pilot tasked with photographing coastal installations noted seeing fresh smoke residue on the rocks around the outpost weeks after radio silence began, suggesting some kind of fire or explosion had taken place. But he saw no bodies, no movement, and no equipment left behind. What bothered him most was the color of the smoke. He described it as gray-blue and unusually dense, unlike the typical black smoke from burning fuel or wood. He circled the area twice. Both times, he recorded the same unsettling detail: no sign of life. Years turned into decades. Records shifted into storage. Most military mysteries from the war eventually found answers, but this one remained stagnant. Historians revisited it occasionally, often discarding it as a footnote, an administrative oversight, a forgotten skirmish, a supply failure. But for every explanation, something didn't fit. Why were there no shell impacts? Why wasn't the radio found? Why were soldiers, personal items, which they normally kept close even in retreat, completely missing? Why did both Japanese and Allied sources describe unusual lights around the cliff in the days following the disappearance? When the island's vegetation finally consumed the remaining structures, the outpost drifted further into obscurity. Only locals continued talking about it, mostly in passing. They remembered their elders warning them not to walk near the cliff after sunset. They mentioned strange echoes when storms rolled in, sounds that seemed to come from under the ground rather than from the sea. Most dismissed it as superstition. But one elder recalled hearing metallic clangs from inside the cliff during the war, like tools striking rock. He believed the soldiers were trying to build something, or escape something. He wasn't sure. What kept the case alive, even faintly, was the absence of closure. Soldiers die in combat, posts fall silent, equipment gets lost, but entire units do not simply vanish without leaving a trace. The cliff held its silence tightly, and for decades no one had reason or the resources to question it. But the mystery didn't disappear. It lingered quietly in military archives, waiting for someone to reopen the file. And 80 years later, when researchers finally returned to the island to investigate new geological anomalies, they would uncover the first physical evidence that the soldiers might not have left the cliff at all, and that whatever happened in 1942 didn't end on the surface. It began underground. For nearly 40 years, the vanished outpost remained nothing more than a wartime footnote, an odd detail tucked between casualty reports and abandoned map grids. It wasn't taught in schools, it wasn't part of any major battle analysis, and it certainly didn't appear in public war retrospectives. It lived only in dusty government archives, referenced so rarely that even historians specializing in the Pacific Theater often overlooked it. But in 1981, long after most veterans had grown old and quiet about their wartime memories, one man unexpectedly brought the story back to life. His name was Captain Shiro Matsuda, a retired Japanese intelligence officer whose post-war decades had been spent teaching history and quietly collecting documents from the era he once served in. When he released a memoir that year, most readers expected political reflections or military insights commonly found in books from aging officers. Instead, tucked halfway into the pages, in a chapter that seemed almost out of place, Matsuda described an outpost on a remote Pacific cliff that, according to him, had not been a normal surveillance point at all. He claimed it had been established to observe something non-military. The phrasing was deliberate, not someone, not enemy movement, not Allied interference, something, and he never explained what that something was. Researchers who later read the passage noticed that Matsuda's tone shifted noticeably in that chapter. The confident, analytical voice he used while discussing troop movements and wartime strategies became restrained and almost cautious. He described the outpost's purpose as sensitive, and said the men assigned there had been screened more thoroughly than those sent to larger, more dangerous posts. He said commanders never disclosed their withdrawal plan, rare for low-priority outposts, and he hinted that the unit stationed there had been chosen based on temperament rather than skill, selecting soldiers who were quiet, obedient, unlikely to question unusual orders. When questioned by journalists, Matsuda refused to expand on the story. He said the rest of the information had been destroyed or sealed after the war. Yet the more he deflected, the more people grew interested, particularly younger researchers who had never heard of the disappearance at all. And as historians began revisiting the case, cracks in the archival record began to appear. The first inconsistency surfaced in supply logs. The outpost had been scheduled to receive 2 shipments in late April of 1942, one containing standard rations and ammunition, another carrying medical supplies and repair tools. Both shipments were recorded as successfully delivered, but neither bore a receiving signature from the station commander. Wartime paperwork was messy, but receiving signatures were standard procedure. The absence of both suggested either the supplies never reached the outpost, or they did, and something prevented the men from signing. Worse, the logs didn't match the quantity of materials later found missing. If supplies had been delivered, they should have left debris, empty crates, rusted cans, fragments of packaging. But post-war investigators reported none of it, not even crushed metal ration tins. It was as if the outpost never received the shipments at all. And if it didn't, who marked the logs? Then came the roster problem. Military units were required to update their personnel lists monthly, noting casualties, transfers, illness, or desertion. But the roster for May 1942, the month the outpost fell silent, didn't exist. The April roster listed 23 men. The June roster listed 19. No explanation, no notes, no record of what happened to the missing 4. And more troubling, the names on the June list didn't match the April one. It appeared as if the Army had replaced almost the entire unit on paper, without any documented transfer, death, or reassignment. But the most compelling anomaly was found tucked inside an unrelated file, buried among naval communications from the region. It was a coded message sent from an unknown field officer to an intelligence division in Tokyo. When finally deciphered decades later, it referenced movement under the cliff and advised continued monitoring until closure is achieved. Researchers immediately connected the phrase to Matsuda's memoir, interpreting it as evidence that something beneath the outpost, underground, not on the surface, was of interest to the Japanese military. Whatever it was, the message suggested it was active. The outpost was built on a cliff that had no documented caves or tunnels, no mining history, no geological survey indicating large hollow spaces. The idea of movement beneath the cliff made no sense geologically, but it appeared again and again in oral accounts collected from island elders. As researchers visited the island in the 1980s, they found locals surprisingly willing to talk about wartime stories that had never been officially recorded. Many remembered being children during the occupation. Their parents and grandparents had warned them to avoid the cliff after dark. Some recalled hearing metallic echoes during storms, sharp, rhythmic clangs, like tools hitting stone. Others described a deep vibration underfoot, subtle but unmistakable, that sometimes rippled through the ground at night. A few elderly residents even claimed to have seen faint lights shining from cracks in the rock, not like lanterns or fires, but more like glowing embers hidden behind stone. Of course, memories can distort over generations, but the consistency of these stories, the echoes, the vibrations, the lights, was impossible to ignore. And when researchers compared the islanders' accounts with wartime Allied reports, a disturbing overlap emerged. Declassified Allied files from the early 90s contained a brief note written by an American reconnaissance pilot who flew low over the region just days after the outpost went silent. He reported seeing fresh earth displaced near the cliff wall, as though soil had been pushed outward from inside. He described the shape as unnatural, almost rectangular, and believed it resulted from digging. But he saw no tools, no collapsed structures, no tracks, nothing resembling a typical trench or foxhole. The disturbed earth was flush against the cliff face, not on top of it. He wrote a final sentence in his log that puzzled historians for years. Whatever they were doing, they buried it too fast. He didn't explain what it was. When this detail reached academic circles, the mystery finally gained serious attention. Historians tried to reconstruct the last weeks of the outpost using available records, but the more they pieced together, the more contradictions they found. One patrol log placed the men performing routine tasks the day before radio silence began. Another, written by a different officer, insisted the unit had been showing signs of internal conflict. A third claimed the men were unstable. But none of those logs were verified, and historians suspected at least one had been altered post-war. The conflicting testimony from surviving Japanese soldiers added more confusion. Those who remembered the outpost at all spoke vaguely, as though the site had been intentionally ignored even during the war. When pressed, a few admitted they had heard rumors, that the men stationed there complained of strange noises, that they requested additional lantern oil unusually often, that they reported tremors no one else felt. One former soldier said he'd heard someone describe the cliff as alive, but he dismissed it as fear talking. Still, the pattern was undeniable: noise, lights, movement, and the war had not produced any enemy activity that could explain these details. By the mid-1990s, researchers began proposing their own theories, some geological, some military, some psychological. A few suspected the outpost had discovered a hidden cave system and attempted to explore it, leading to a collapse. Others believed the soldiers had unearthed something buried long before the war and were ordered to cover it up. Some proposed that desperation, isolation, and poor leadership had triggered mass panic. But none of those explanations accounted for the missing equipment, the erased rosters, the buried earth described by the pilot, or the coded message referencing movement beneath the cliff. Something was happening underground, something the soldiers might have been instructed to monitor. And if Matsuda's memoir was accurate, the Japanese military had known about it long before the outpost vanished. For decades, the mystery hovered at the edge of historical curiosity, strange, unsettling, but unprovable. It remained frozen in ink and oral memory, a story without enough evidence to pursue. And it might have stayed that way forever if not for a new generation of researchers, armed with better technology and a willingness to investigate remote places long abandoned. When they finally returned to the island, guided by old maps, fatting rumors, and files once buried in military archives, they discovered the first physical sign that the wartime rumors were rooted in something real. The ground beneath the cliff was hollow, and whatever had happened in 1942 had begun not on the surface, but deep underground, exactly where the soldiers had been warned to keep their eyes. The island had always been the kind of place people passed over without noticing, a narrow strip of volcanic stone, windswept, isolated, and covered in vegetation so dense it looked almost bruised from a distance. For decades, it held no strategic value, no industry, no reason for anyone to land unless they were forced by weather or desperation. But in the early 2000s, long after the war had faded into textbooks, the island drew a small group of researchers who arrived with folded maps, aging military files, and the unsettling realization that no modern expedition had ever seriously tried to locate the vanished outpost. What brought them there was the accumulation of small, unexplained details: the memoir, the coded message, the pilot's account, and the strange oral histories that refused to disappear. A university anthropologist named Dr. Elias Rourke had spent years studying wartime disappearances. When he found the inconsistencies surrounding the outpost, he believed something had been overlooked. With new technology at his disposal and funding from a historical research grant, he organized a small interdisciplinary team: 2 geologists, an archivist, a field medic, and a graduate student who specialized in radar imaging. They traveled by boat, carrying portable scanning equipment, notebooks, and the kind of cautious optimism that fills researchers before stepping into a story that has never been fully told. The island greeted them with heavy humidity, thick swarms of insects, and a wind that scraped across the cliffside like a dull blade. The local guides, hired weeks in advance, greeted the team warmly but with an unusual tension beneath their politeness. They answered questions about the cliff, about the old stories, and about the wartime years, but grew visibly uncomfortable each time someone mentioned staying near the headland after sunset. They didn't elaborate. They simply said the air changed at night, that the wind came from the ground instead of the sea, and that the rock made noises no rock should make. By the time the researchers set up camp near the base of the cliff, the sun was already dropping behind the water. The cliff wall towered above them like a sheet of weathered iron. It looked solid enough to be utterly ordinary, but the weight of the stories, metallic echoes, tremors, lights, gave every crevice and shadow a strange presence. No one said it aloud, but the team felt it, that sense of standing at the mouth of something old and unfinished. The next morning, they began their survey. Using ground-penetrating radar, they mapped the surface layer by layer, slowly peeling back the earth in digital slices. For the first few hours, the scans showed dense volcanic rock expected for the region, but around midday, the graduate student monitoring the readings froze. The screen displayed a perfectly straight void running horizontally beneath the cliff. Its edges were sharp, rectangular, and roughly the size of a tunnel. Natural cave systems rarely formed such shapes. This had been carved. Rourke studied the scan, his expression tight. The void didn't appear to be collapsed entirely. It sagged in places, but its outline held. What struck the team most was its placement, precisely where wartime maps had marked the edge of the missing outpost. They scanned again from a different angle. The rectangular void appeared once more, buried nearly 12 feet below the surface. It ran parallel to the cliff, ending abruptly beneath a sharp outcrop, a location that matched almost exactly with the patch of freshly displaced earth observed by the American pilot decades earlier. It was the first physical confirmation that something man-made existed under the cliff, and whatever it was, the soldiers stationed there had either built it, discovered it, or tried to seal it. The discovery unsettled the local guides more than the researchers expected. When the team presented the scans, hopping for insight or local context, the guides exchanged uneasy looks. None would approach the cliff that evening. One said he had heard shuffling noises near that very area as a child during a storm, a dragging, intermittent movement like feet sliding over stone. Another said the cliff exhaled at night, pushing cool air outward as though the ground itself was breathing. They insisted these stories were not superstition but memory, and they warned the team not to dig until morning. That night, wind whipped through the foliage with unusual strength. The guides slept farther from the cliff than the researchers and refused to face the rock as they lay down. No one spoke of hearing anything, but several members of the team reported waking abruptly around 3 a.m., feeling as though a subtle tremor had traveled through the ground beneath their sleeping mats. One wrote in her field notes that the air vibrated for a moment, then went still, though she dismissed it as the effect of wind or fatigue. The next day, the survey expanded outward. As they mapped the terrain near the cliff base, they found something unexpected: a scatter of rusted shell casings buried shallowly beneath a layer of loam and vine roots. They marked the positions before disturbing anything further. When plotted on a grid, the casings formed a loose arc, like a defensive line, but the angle of the expended rounds made no sense. The bullets had been fired inward, toward the cliff wall, not outward toward an enemy. It was the first clue contradicting the official wartime record, which claimed the outpost had been positioned to observe and intercept Allied movement. Soldiers firing toward the cliff suggested something had come from the rock itself. The team collected the casings carefully, photographing each one. The metal was heavily corroded, but the head stamps matched Japanese munitions from the early war years. Some were dented or bent, others cleanly spent. One casing was fused to a small chunk of stone, as though it had been fired during a collapse or near intense heat. The geologists ran their fingers over the cliff at the point the arc seemed to converge. Beneath layers of lichen and moss, they found faint scrape marks, shallow, scattered, and weathered almost to nothing, but just enough to suggest that the stone had once been impacted repeatedly. They recorded the findings but couldn't determine whether the impacts were caused by shovels, rifle butts, or something else. Nearby, half buried under soil and tangled roots, they found a helmet. It was a Type 90 Japanese combat helmet, rusted through on one side where seawater and time had chewed the metal. The insignia on the front, though barely visible, was cracked straight through as if a hard blow had struck it. Inside the helmet, they found compacted dirt and a portion of frayed cloth. No skull, no bones, no traces of the soldier who once wore it. The absence felt heavier than the object itself. As they cataloged the location, the team realized the helmet was positioned not along a path or near any structure, but directly above the rectangular void detected by radar. It was as though someone had dropped it, or lost it, during the final moments above the buried tunnel. The discovery changed the tone of the entire expedition. What had begun as a search for a forgotten outpost now felt like the uncovering of a final stand. The researchers grew quieter, more deliberate in their movements, listening unintentionally for the faint noises the guides had described. Even Rourke, who had spent his career studying disappearances, seemed unsettled by the pattern emerging from the cliffside. To understand the significance, the archivist combed through the unit's surviving records each evening. The more he reviewed them, the more contradictions appeared. The outpost was supposedly a minor assignment, yet its men carried enough ammunition to sustain multiple engagements. The medical supplies shipped there were excessive for a small unit, and the messages referencing movement under the cliff suddenly seemed less metaphorical and more literal. By the fourth day, the team decided they needed to identify the point where the cliff might be hiding an entry. Using the radar scans as a guide, they triangulated the void's uppermost boundary. The rock there was slightly softer, with small fissures spreading like veins across its surface. It wasn't an entrance, but a weakened point, likely where rock had been placed intentionally to seal something. Late that afternoon, as clouds thickened above the island, one of the geologists leaned close to the rock and felt a sudden cool draft brush against his cheek. Startled, he stepped back. He called the others, and together they pressed their hands near the fissure. At first, they felt nothing. Then, as the wind shifted above the cliff, a thin breath of cold air slipped through the stone, a pulse, brief and precise, like the exhale of a lung. It wasn't constant. It wasn't natural airflow from cracks in the formation. It came in deliberate intervals, the same way island elders had described it, the cliff breathing. The guides watching from the tree line quietly packed their belongings and refused to remain near the headland for the night. They said the air meant the storm would push the cliff awake. The team tried to ask what that meant, but the guides walked away before answering, moving toward the safer interior of the island until morning. Storm clouds rolled in as dusk settled, heavy and dark, gathering above the ocean like a curtain ready to drop. The researchers stood at the base of the cliff, staring at the narrow fissures where the air had escaped. They could feel the tension shifting, as though the island was preparing to reveal something long buried. The shell casings, the helmet, the void beneath their feet, each detail pressed into their thoughts, forming a pattern that still felt incomplete. What they didn't know was that the storm would bring more than rain. It would bring the first clear sign that the missing outpost had not been destroyed by battle, starvation, or retreat. Something had happened inside that cliff. And whatever it was, the soldiers had not run from it. They had faced it. They began clearing the headland just after dawn, when the light was soft and the air still held the chill from the night before. The research team had already spent a week mapping the slope, flagging anomalies, debating possibilities that none of them fully believed. But the scans were unmistakable. Something large and perfectly geometric lay beneath the vegetation, exactly where the wartime patrol logs mentioned seeing smoke before the disappearance. By the time the first machete swing sliced through a curtain of vines, every member of the team felt it, a pressure in the air, a sense that they were disturbing something that had been left alone for a reason. The soil near the cliff was strangely loose, turning to powder at the faintest touch. Even the roots felt thin, as if they'd grown reluctantly over whatever had been forced shut beneath them. Hours passed with a steady rhythm of scraping, cutting, pushing aside the dense growth until one of the graduate students gasped. Peeking out from a mat of moss was the edge of a stone slab. It didn't match the island's volcanic rock. It had been shaped, carved, and placed, a deliberate construction at a site where no one expected architecture. When the team cleared the remaining brush, the carved lintel revealed itself fully, a horizontal stone beam resting on two uneven pillars of cut rock. Time had chewed away at the details, but faint chisel marks were still visible in the stone, lines too clean to be natural. The lintel framed what had once been an entrance, now packed solid with dirt and broken debris. The entire opening had been sealed with an almost obsessive thoroughness, layer after layer forced into place until the entrance disappeared completely. No official Japanese records had ever mentioned a tunnel. No Allied report referenced excavation. Yet here it was, a doorway hidden behind decades of silence. The university team exchanged looks they couldn't verbalize. A sealed passage could mean anything, a forgotten supply cache, an improvised bunker, a collapsed cave. But the way it had been filled suggested urgency, not abandonment. One of the archaeologists touched the packed soil and flinched. It wasn't just dirt. It was compacted clay mixed with crushed coral and charred wood, materials melted together by fire. Someone had tried to seal this place fast and permanently. When they finally broke through the first portion of the fill, a faint current of air escaped, stale and cold. It wasn't much, just enough to raise goosebumps on arms and make the younger researchers step back. The lead archaeologist leaned in, shining her headlamp into the thin fracture. The beam showed only layers of compacted rubble, but she sensed depth behind it, a hollow waiting to be opened. The team worked carefully, carving out a small channel at the top, widening the gap inch by inch. It took most of the afternoon, and as the sun dipped lower, the first glimpse of the interior appeared. A narrow void, no wider than a hallway, ran beyond the fill. Dust swirled in the light, floating in thin threads as if disturbed after years of settling. The lead archaeologist crawled forward, her movements slow, her breathing loud in the confined space. The others followed, each person feeling that same uneasy awareness. They were entering a place last touched by men who never walked out. Inside, the tunnel was strangely preserved. The walls were reinforced with wooden supports, some splintered, others nearly intact. The ground was packed dirt, smoother than expected, as if swept repeatedly. Along the walls were rusted brackets that once held oil lamps. One lamp remained, lying on its side with a wick still partially intact, like someone had dropped it mid-step. Farther in, the floor scattered with small artifacts, a tin cup, a broken spoon, a ration tin flattened under a boot heel, a battered notebook swollen with moisture. Someone picked up the notebook, but its pages dissolved at the edges, forming a pulp that stuck to their gloves. Another researcher found a scrap of paper pinned under a stone. It looked like an order form, written in hurried strokes. Only a few words could be made out, but the last line stood out clearly. Hold position until the movement stops. Movement. The word hung heavy in the stale air. Movement of what? Supplies? Troops? Something under the cliff, like the coded message hinted decades earlier. None of the team could answer, yet the silence of the tunnel felt weighted, as if it still held the memory of what the last men here tried to contain. The deeper they moved, the thicker the stillness became. Every sound echoed back unnaturally fast, bouncing off the narrow walls. At the far end of the tunnel where the light dimmed, they discovered something worse than absence. Along the walls, faint but unmistakable, were long scraping marks. They were clustered in uneven rows, some shallow, some deep, some jagged and frantic. They ran vertically and horizontally, overlapping like dozens of hands had dragged or clawed across the stone at once. The marks grew denser the farther in they went, forming chaotic patterns no natural erosion could create. Someone whispered that the scratches looked human. Another argued it could be tools, weapons dragged along in panic. But everyone knew what the patterns suggested: the desperation of someone or several people trying to dig their way out. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became. The sealing of the tunnel had not been the work of outside forces. It had been done from the inside. One researcher crouched near a cluster of deep gouges, tracing the grooves with trembling fingers. The stone had been struck repeatedly with significant force. Whatever caused these marks had not been quiet or calm. It had been violent, frantic, maybe even terrified. But there were no remains. No bones, no fabric, no rusted weapons lying next to fallen men. The tunnel was almost staged, objects left in place, but the people removed. The team collected samples from the scratched walls. Under the portable microscope, embedded inside the deepest grooves, they found remnants of something organic. It wasn't skin. It wasn't wood. It was fibrous, dark, and unidentifiable. The sample was bagged quickly, though none of the researchers wanted to admit the truth forming in their thoughts. The tunnel floor showed signs of collapse, but not a natural one. One of the geologists analyzed the roof and determined the beams had been forcibly broken from below. The impact marks pointed upward, not downward, as if the soldiers themselves had destroyed the support structures. The collapse didn't kill them, it trapped whatever was on the other side. The lead archaeologist sat against the wall, trying to frame a hypothesis that sounded rational. Perhaps the men panicked after a cave-in. Maybe they sealed off a tunnel to prevent the enemy from discovering a radio room or confidential intelligence. But the scratch marks didn't fit any military explanation. Neither did the deliberate reinforcement of the walls or the charred mixture used to seal the entrance. None of it matched wartime construction methods. Everything suggested containment, not fortification. When the team moved deeper toward the back of the tunnel, they found a final artifact that made their stomachs tight. Half buried near the collapsed section was a wooden crate stamped with Japanese military insignia. The lid was splintered, but inside they found glass vials shattered against the wood. The labels were unreadable, but the liquid residue had dried into a dark, sticky film. Next to the crate lay an ink-stained brush and a fragment of paper with blurred characters. Only one kanji remained clear, the one meaning dangerous. The team debated whether this indicated a biological storage container, but the markings didn't match any known wartime chemical division. And the presence of oil lamps, ration tins, and handwritten notes suggested the soldiers weren't preparing a laboratory. They were trying to survive. The emotional weight settled on them slowly. Dozens of men had lived here. They had eaten here, slept here, written their orders here. They had tried everything to keep something out or something in until the collapse forced the final decision. But how had none of their bodies survived? Why was the tunnel empty except for their belongings and their desperate marks? As they prepared to leave the site for the evening, the lead archaeologist remained by the lintel, staring at the sealed entrance from the inside. She imagined the soldiers on their final night, stacking debris, shoveling dirt, hammering beams into place until their arms shook. She imagined the moment they realized the collapse was the only solution, and the moment they accepted they would never escape. It was not the story of men overtaken by enemy forces. It was the story of men who sacrificed themselves to prevent something worse from reaching the world outside. The team emerged just as the last light faded. The night wind rushed past them, funneling through the gap they had created in the cliff. It carried a low, hollow sound, almost like air passing through an empty chamber. The researchers stood in silence, each one looking back toward the darkened tunnel with a mix of awe and dread. For the first time, the disappearance of the outpost didn't feel like a mystery. It felt like a warning. And as they prepared their tools for the next day's excavation, none of them noticed what the youngest member later admitted he heard. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoing from deep inside the sealed passage, as though something was stirring in the darkness the soldiers tried so hard to bury. The lower chamber revealed itself not through luck, but through frustration. For days, the team had argued over the scattered clues left in the upper tunnel, the claw marks, the shattered vials, the frantic notes, the collapse that seemed too intentional for panic and too desperate for protocol. They refused to believe that the upper passage was the end of the story. Something about the space felt incomplete, as if the real heart of the outpost still waited below them, sealed away in deeper layers of earth. It was late afternoon when the ground-penetrating radar finally returned something unusual. Not another tunnel, but a void. A rectangular cavity, larger than the first, lying more than 20 feet beneath the floor. The walls of the void reflected back with unnaturally smooth lines, too straight to be natural rock. A constructed space, one that had never been reported in any surviving military document. The radar technician stared at the screen for a long moment before saying what everyone was already thinking. This was the true outpost. The upper tunnel was only a barrier. They marked the coordinates and began drilling. The soil changed almost at once. The ground that had been soft and almost powdery in the upper tunnel was replaced by compacted earth mixed with stone. Dust fell in slow, heavy sheets. The deeper they went, the colder it became, as if the earth itself resisted the intrusion. One of the researchers commented that the temperature drop felt unnatural. Another joked nervously that maybe the island wanted the chamber left alone. No one laughed. By the time their drill broke through, the sun had already set outside. The hole they created released a sudden rush of cold air that smelled faintly metallic. They widened the opening with handheld tools, clearing debris until a small circular shaft appeared. The lead archaeologist lowered a lantern through the hole, watching the light sway in the darkness. After several seconds, it touched a floor, a smooth, flat surface covered in a thin layer of dust. No collapses, no debris. The lower chamber was intact. A climbing rope was anchored, and the youngest member volunteered to descend first. As he disappeared into the darkness, his voice echoed upward, slow and uncertain. He described a wide room with metal walls. A bunker, not a tunnel. The faint glint of steel reflected the lantern light. He said it felt untouched, no signs of disturbance, just the stillness of a place frozen in time. One by one, the team followed, landing quietly on the metal floor. Their light spread through the chamber, revealing a space unlike anything in the upper tunnel. The walls weren't carved stone. They were reinforced steel plates bolted together. The ceiling arched slightly, supported by beams that had barely aged. Along the far wall were 3 large crates stamped with faded medical insignia. Their lids were partly open, revealing empty compartments lined with rotted padding. Gauze, broken glass, and rusted instruments lay scattered near one crate, some still wrapped in wax paper. Everything seemed untouched since the day it was abandoned. The air held a strange heaviness, dense with memories and tension. There was no mold, no rot, no smell of decay, only the metallic scent that had drifted up through the drill hole. It reminded the team of an old surgical ward, sterile, cold, unwelcoming. Toward the center of the room stood a long wooden table covered in burnt paper. Someone had tried to destroy documents here. Ashes clung to the grain of the wood, some fused together in brittle chunks that still held traces of handwriting. One researcher sifted through the debris carefully until she found a page that had survived at the edges. It contained a list of dates in early 1942, each followed by brief, cryptic phrases. Fever spreads. 2 missing at dawn. Voices along the wall. None of it resembled standard military logging. But the most disturbing part of the chamber lay at the back, where a steel door stood warped outward at the frame. The hinges had bent until they snapped, and the center of the door bulged as though it had been struck from inside with impossible force. It didn't look like the aftermath of an explosion. It looked like something had pushed or rammed its way out with raw strength. The metal was bowed outward in a smooth curve. Even with decades of rust softening its edges, the violence of it was unmistakable. The team circled the door slowly, afraid to imagine what had caused such distortion. One of the archaeologists ran his glove across the warped surface and whispered that no human being could do that. Another suggested a blast from a trapped pocket of air or gas, but the clean outward arc didn't resemble any natural pressure event. Whatever pushed it had been deliberate. Beyond the door lay a second chamber, smaller and darker. Their lanterns illuminated a stretcher, overturned medical trays, and a cluster of glass jars shattered against the wall. Thin fragments glittered in the dust, the remains of a makeshift infirmary. A narrow desk stood in the corner, its drawers half open, papers spilling from the edges. And on top of the desk, shielded from the burn marks that scorched the rest of the documents, lay a leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked, the stitching coming apart, but the pages inside were surprisingly well preserved. The lead archaeologist opened it with care, revealing the handwriting of the Outpost's commanding officer. The entries began formally, detailing supplies received, daily rations, patrol notes. But by the 5th page, the tone shifted. The handwriting loosened, slanted, became more hurried. The officer wrote about men getting sick, not coughing or bleeding, just collapsing suddenly as if their bodies had been drained of strength. He described headaches severe enough to make even the strongest soldiers cry out. He wrote about insomnia spreading through the unit, and men claiming their dreams were filled with whispers. The next entries blurred between fear and confusion. The officer described soldiers waking in the night convinced someone was standing next to their bunks. 2 men insisted they heard footsteps echoing from the cliff walls, even when they were alone on night watch. One soldier refused to sleep entirely, claiming whenever he closed his eyes, he heard scratching beneath the ground. The officer tried to maintain discipline. He ordered health checks, reported symptoms, requested extraction, but the entries revealed a mounting dread he couldn't hide. He wrote that 3 men vanished during a storm, their rifles left behind near the cliff's edge. A 4th claimed the missing men had simply walked into the darkness because something whispered for them. The officer dismissed him as delusional until the soldier himself disappeared 2 nights later. Further down the journal, the entries turned grim. The officer noted hearing faint metallic sounds echoing through the tunnels like something tapping along the walls. He wrote that the sickness had spread, but no one understood what it was. No fever, no wounds, just exhaustion, fear, hallucinations, and then disappearance. He told himself it was desertion, but the pattern was too strange, too synchronized, too silent. The most chilling entries came from the final week. The handwriting was shaky and the grammar fractured. The officer wrote that some of the men claimed the cliffs were breathing. Others heard voices calling them by name. One described seeing a figure in the tunnel, tall and pale, standing motionless near the upper entrance. When they rushed to investigate, nothing was there, only the quiet hum of air pushing through the sealed rock. The officer ordered the lower chamber sealed. His writing grew desperate. He said something had infected the men's minds, something tied to the cliff itself. He feared the medical crates contained more than supplies, that perhaps they were sent to monitor something already known. He had tried burning the documents to prevent misuse, but the men panicked, believing the fire would draw attention to their location. His final entry was short, almost painfully simple. Seal the lower tunnel, no matter who survives. The researchers went still. Every breath echoed too loudly in the metal room. They read the sentence again, unable to process the weight of it. The officer hadn't written evacuate. He hadn't written hold position. He had written a death sentence not for the enemy but for his own men, and he had done it with clarity, as if this was the only way to protect the world above. The team looked around the room again, noticing details they missed before. Deep scratch marks at the base of the warped steel door, a line of dried dark residue trailing from the stretcher to the wall, a single boot lying in the corner, the leather sliced open as though torn by force, not decay. The silence in the chamber felt suffocating, thick with the presence of men who died unseen and unheard. One of the researchers stepped into the room beyond the warped door and knelt near the wall. His light picked up faint marks in the dust, footprints. Not just one set, many. They overlapped in all directions, but none led to the exit. They ended abruptly in the middle of the floor, as if the men who made them simply vanished. The emotional exhaustion hit the group almost at once. They felt the weight of 70 years of unanswered questions pressing down on them. They were no longer just scientists uncovering evidence. They had stepped into a moment frozen by fear, a moment the officer had tried to bury with his last breath. As they prepared to ascend the rope and leave the chamber for the night, the lead archaeologist glanced back into the darkness. The warped steel door loomed in the shifting lantern light, its surface cold and silent. She whispered that whatever the soldiers sealed away, they had believed it was worse than death, worse than disappearance, worse than the unknown terror that had hollowed out their outpost. No one argued, no one spoke at all. And long after they climbed out, sealing the hole behind them with a temporary cover, the lower chamber remained still. But the cold draft that followed them up the rope hinted at something else, not movement, not sound, just a lingering presence that felt like it had waited decades for footsteps to return. They returned at dawn with heavier lights, breathable masks, and enough recording equipment to document every inch without disturbing the fragile chamber. Silence clung to the air as they lowered themselves again into the steel bunker, each step echoing with the weight of the officer's final words. The journal had raised more questions than answers, but one detail stood out above all. The entries repeatedly referenced movement under the cliff. The researchers believed the warped steel door might not have led merely to a medical annex. They suspected it marked the threshold to something older, something natural, something that existed before any military engineer ever stepped foot on the island. Beyond the door's twisted frame lay a narrow corridor where the metal plating abruptly ended. The floor transitioned to rough, uneven stone that sloped downward, lit only by the flickering beams of their handheld lamps. The air grew colder, and the metallic smell faded into an oceanic dampness, thick with salt. Small droplets clung to the rock ceiling and fell intermittently, tapping against the stone like a faint heartbeat. A few meters in, the corridor widened into a steep passageway carved not by hands or tools, but by geological pressure and time. A natural tunnel, one the soldiers must have discovered long before its existence was ever reported. As the team descended further, the darkness grew suffocating. The walls narrowed, forcing them to move single file. The space felt older than the war, older than the island's recorded history. Something about the rock seemed unnatural, not in shape, but in its silence. Most caves hummed faintly with life, the flutter of insects, the echo of water, the distant rush of wind. Here, there was nothing, only the steady drip of condensation and the weight of the cliff overhead, pressing down like a closed fist. The passage abruptly opened into a wide cavern, larger than any of them expected. Their lights swept across vast stone formations rising like frozen waves. Stalactites hung above them in jagged clusters, glistening with moisture. But what drew every eye, what froze the team in place, were the remains. The bones lay deep within the fissures of the cavern floor, arranged in positions that made no sense. Dozens of skeletal forms wedged themselves into cracks in the rock, some curled into fetal positions, others reaching downward as though they had crawled into the narrow spaces willingly. A few skeletons were stacked, as if multiple bodies had attempted to climb into the same crevice. It looked like a scene of desperation without direction, men trying to escape something not behind them, but around them. Their uniforms were mostly gone, reduced to scraps, but enough insignia remained to confirm what they already knew. These were the soldiers from the Outpost. The missing unit that vanished in 1942 had not fled outward or upward toward rescue. They had fled downward, deeper into the cliff, hiding themselves inside the earth as if they were trying to escape from the air itself. One of the researchers knelt beside the nearest set of remains, studying the posture. The ribcage leaned forward, arms reaching into the fissure, fingers curved around a rock that had broken off decades ago. The soldier had wedged his body into a space too small for survival. It had likely suffocated him within minutes. Whatever drove him here, it overpowered every instinct for oxygen, safety, or logic. Further inside the cavern sat a cluster of rifles arranged in a tight circle on the ground. Some were snapped in half from rust, others leaned against one another in an odd formation. The barrels pointed inward, all facing the same point on the cavern wall. None were aimed outward as they would be in combat. They were pointed toward a smooth stone surface that differed from the rest of the cavern. It was unnaturally even, almost polished, and char marks spread across it in patches, blackened and cracked. The team moved closer, examining the wall. The scorch patterns varied, some broad and smeared, others sharp-edged. Under the residue lay shallow pits and grooves from explosive impacts. At least 4 different blast points were visible. The soldiers had detonated charges here, not to break out but to break in. One of the archaeologists whispered that the soldiers had been firing and blasting at this wall from inside the cavern, forming that tight circle as if bracing for something to emerge, but nothing had come through. There were no tunnels behind the smoothed stone, no ruins, no mechanical installations, just rock, solid and lifeless. They found shell casings scattered at the soldiers' feet, arranged in arcs from repeated firing, but there were no signs of return fire, no enemy bullets, no scorch marks from opposing weapons. Whatever the soldiers feared, it never manifested in a way the team could identify. Near the wall lay a torn leather pouch. Inside, wrapped carefully in waxed cloth, was a flat metal plate the size of a notebook. After brushing away decades of dust, they discovered scratched writing in Japanese characters. It was crude and uneven, carved with a blade or nail. But even without translation, they could see the emotion in each stroke. The writing grew crooked toward the end, as though the hand carving it had trembled violently. A translator read it aloud, each word sinking into the cavern's heavy air. It wasn't the enemy. It was the cliff. The team stood still for a long time, listening to the cavern swallow the words. There was no wind, no echo, only the soft drip of water and the distant churn of waves filtering through the stone. The inscription felt like a final confession, left by a dying man with just enough strength to etch the truth into metal. They spread out searching for other clues. No poisonous gas canisters, no machinery, no traces of Allied weapons or sabotage, no sign of an invasive species, animal attack, or geological collapse that could explain the mass panic. The cavern showed no signs of seismic instability. The remains bore no trauma marks. Their weapons had been fired at the same wall repeatedly, but at nothing discernible. A forensic specialist examined the bones. There were no fractures consistent with combat, no residue of chemicals, no signs of predation. The soldiers had not fought a creature, a force, or one another. Whatever caused their panic left no trace on their bodies. The researchers moved deeper into the cavern, careful not to disturb the remains. They found more fissures filled with bones, some wedged so deeply that only the tips of fingers or parts of skulls were visible. The deeper they searched, the more confusing the arrangement became. It appeared that the soldiers hadn't scattered randomly. They seemed to have fled in the same direction, downward, always downward, as if trying to reach a destination or escape something rising from behind. But the path ended abruptly at a sheer rock wall. No tunnels extended beyond. The cavern was a dead end. The only exit was the passage they had descended, the one the soldiers never used. One researcher asked quietly why none of the soldiers tried to escape upward, toward the bunker, toward the cliff face, toward daylight. Another asked why their rifles pointed inward, aimed at a wall that showed no sign of intrusion. The team had no answers. Everything they uncovered only sharpened the contradictions. For hours, they documented every detail: temperature readings, surface scans, photos of bone positions and rifle angles, but nothing touched the heart of the matter: the official explanation from the war that the outpost had been destroyed in combat no longer made sense. So did any theory that involved a known enemy. There was no evidence of Allied contact, no sign of an attack, no sabotage. The commanding officer's journal hadn't mentioned an enemy force. He had written only about voices, sickness, fear, the cliffs, and then his final order: seal the lower tunnel. One of the researchers stood near the circle of rifles for a long moment, staring at the polished stone wall. "Why fire at something that isn't there?" he whispered. But the truth was uncomfortable. The soldiers might have seen something the researchers couldn't detect, or they might have imagined it, or the stress, claustrophobia, and sickness might have driven them to collective madness. But collective madness didn't explain everything. It didn't explain why the medical crates in the bunker had been emptied. It didn't explain the warped steel door pushed from inside. It didn't explain the officer's certainty that sealing the tunnel would save lives. It didn't explain the orderly positioning of rifles in a defensive circle. And it certainly didn't explain the inscription left by the dying officer. A geologist examined the smooth cavern wall again. He scraped at the surface with a metal pick. The pick barely scratched it. This section of rock was harder than the surrounding stone, compacted differently, compressed as if shaped by extreme pressure. But it wasn't artificial. There were no seams, no hidden chambers, no hollow spaces behind it. Just a strange geological anomaly, a wall that felt out of place, as though the earth had grown differently here. Another researcher suggested the cliff might contain pockets of subterranean gas capable of inducing hallucinations or panic, but tests showed nothing unusual. No methane, no hydrogen sulfide, nothing that would explain the scale of fear or the soldiers' desperate retreat. By late afternoon, the team finally gathered their equipment and began the climb back to the bunker. They paused at the warped steel door, staring again at the outward curve. Whatever pushed it had come from within the bunker, not from the cavern. Something had once tried to escape into the tunnel, not from it. But there were no survivors, no intruder, no animal remains. Only the silent chamber below, filled with the soldiers who tried to flee deeper into the cliff. The sun was rising when they finally emerged into daylight, blinking at the brightness. The ocean stretched endlessly beside them, calm and indifferent. The cliff loomed behind them, its rocky face weathered and silent. No movement, no sound, just stone. Weeks later, when they compiled their findings into a formal report, the final conclusion was unsatisfying even to them. There was no enemy, no battle, no evidence of Allied presence. Nothing paranormal, nothing scientifically confirmed, nothing that fit neatly into the known history of the war. The soldiers died underground, terrified of something the researchers couldn't identify, something that left no physical trace, something only hinted at in the officer's final inscription. It wasn't the enemy. It was the cliff. The outpost's disappearance remained one of World War II's coldest, most ambiguous mysteries. The tunnel discovered beneath the cliff had revealed the soldiers' final moments, but not the truth behind their terror. And the deeper the team dug, the more they realized the cliff itself wasn't hiding answers. It was hiding questions. Questions the Earth had held for 8 decades, sealed beneath stone, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to open the door again. The case closed without resolution. No theories could be proven, no enemy identified, no explanation accepted. The cliff remained silent, its secrets buried in the cavern where the soldiers made their final stand, rifles pointed at solid rock. And long after the researchers departed, The tides continued to rise and fall against the island's base, brushing the edges of a stone chamber unchanged by time, untouched by light, and undisturbed, until someone else decides to descend back into the place where an entire outpost vanished without a trace.